The presence of Dr. McKee and the Patriots in the same magazine article celebrating the year's most extraordinary people and events gives us a sense of the place of football in our culture and the way people in this country have come to regard the game. By any measure, it is the most popular game in the United States, and by any measure, it is also the game most likely to permanently damage the brains of the men who play it. The research of Dr. McKee and others has changed attitudes and in some cases even the behavior of some football fans. Bob Costas, one of the nation's best known and most popular sports broadcasters, recently said, quote, "Football's days are numbered because the game destroys people's brains." Skeptics may be reminded that at the end of his career as a boxing announcer, Howard Cosell announced that boxing was doomed, but not until he'd made a great deal of money off boxing. And perhaps the same is true of Bob Costas. He doesn't broadcast football games anymore. However, they were both right. More representative is NPR Weekend Edition Saturday host Scott Simon. Shortly after the 2017-2018 NFL regular season ended, he expressed in a tweet his dismay with the damage that football does to the brains of the players and maintained that he hadn't watched much football this year, although he still checked in on the scores from time to time and certainly intended to watch the Super Bowl. So I'm not quite sure how you can have it both ways, but this is presumably because it is, well, the Super Bowl. I think there are probably a lot of people who are honestly troubled by the near certainty that some large number of the players will damage their brains, and so they now watch the game with a certain amount of guilt or shame, and they hope that at least while they're watching, nobody will stagger witlessly around in circles or have to be carried unconscious from the field. Half a dozen years ago, I wrote an article for New Politics magazine, which at the time was edited by a very close and dear friend of mine named Marvin Mandel. And I speculated about why this is the only country in which football is the most popular sport. I suggested that it's a good fit in a nation that accounts for almost 70% of the global arms sales. Well before Donald Trump asked rhetorically why we have nuclear weapons if we're not going to use them, this nation was number one in the world at making, selling, and using weapons. It still is. The U.S. is also number one in terms of military bases maintained around the world. According to a story just published this month in The Nation, this country has 800 military bases in 172 countries around the world. I read that article and my first thought was I didn't realize there were 172 countries. But apparently there are even more because there must be a few in which we don't have military bases. For comparison's sake, Russia has something like 40 bases in 9 countries. How many people are protesting the existence of these 800 military bases? Maybe there is little protesting because lots of people don't know about it. But maybe it's because lots of people are okay with it. Here at home, mass shootings have become commonplace. I forget, it's either 11 or 12 school shootings so far in 2018. And we're not very far into 2018. People vote according to which candidate is in favor of any citizen's right to possess an automatic weapon. Where else on earth do folks not engaged in the drug trade or gang warfare feel that they need an AK-47? Where else do citizens regard the right to possess such a weapon as equal to the right to have free speech and a free press? As Tom Engelhardt wrote in The American Way of War, quote, "America's true religion is addiction to force. And the point of football is to score points while preventing your opponent from doing that. But everybody who plays or watches the game knows that beating up your opponent is intrinsic to that process. Otherwise, the Patriots and the Cowboys and the team in Washington, D.C., which plays under the name that shall not be mentioned, would be playing flag football." It's been demonstrated over and over again that the most certain way for a president to shore up his poll ratings is to go to war. Granted, he doesn't want the war to go on too long. People get tired of the same old violence, and maybe that's why football games only last 60 minutes, plus a couple of hours devoted to selling beer, trucks, and products to treat erectile dysfunction, as well as the military itself. The phrase, "be all that you can be," is particularly revealing. If you can't be a pro football player, be a Marine. None of this is to suggest that the U.S. is the only nation in which a dangerous sport is popular. Mixed martial arts and boxing flourish in various countries, as do dogfighting and cockfighting. And in some backwater somewhere, bear baiting may still be going on. But there is no other nation in which a sport certain to render some number of the participants brain damaged has become so mainstream. Football games feature flyovers by fighter jets, high school bands, pop singers, and appearances by military leaders and holders of high office. Owners of pro football teams are celebrated as heroes when they decide not to move their teams. They're given subsidies and tax breaks by mayors and governors, terrified that unless they are provided with such perks, the owners will move on. Such mayors and governors must feel that their constituents cannot possibly do without football. And I wonder if they're right. The phrase "too big to fail" was first applied to banks, but perhaps it can also apply to the wealthiest and most popular of our games. Colleges and universities for which football serves as the front porch. But by that I mean it's their advertising. People know about Notre Dame football who don't have any idea what else Notre Dame might do, and so on down the line, Michigan State, Ohio, whatever. They've made football and the football team a primary fundraising tool. Their investment in the game is enormous, and from that standpoint, the business model can't be beat. What enterprise couldn't turn a profit if it didn't have to pay the labor? Even if it had to pay the top manager $7 or $8 million a year, and that's what the football coaches at the biggest universities are currently paid. And of course, the labor is the players who are paid nothing, and who in fact are suspended if somebody discovers that they've gotten a free ride to the airport from an assistant coach. But back to the pro game, since it is pro teams that will compete on Super Sunday today. Perhaps the most compelling arguments on behalf of pro football, this is from high school. They tell you when you're trying to make an argument, you have to make the opposition argument and then knock it down. Otherwise, people won't pay any attention to you. So, the most compelling arguments on behalf of pro football are that the players in the NFL are adults who understand the risks when they sign their contracts, and the game gives some small number of exceptionally talented and dedicated men the opportunity to help their families out of poverty. And this is a myth at the very center of the so-called American dream, despite the current research demonstrating that children born poor are very nearly certain to die poor. In the case of football, it's important to understand that players entering the NFL are adults, albeit very young adults, and some of them do remain in the game long enough to make a lot of money, but not all that many of them, because the average NFL career is about 3 years. Beyond that, historically, the players have not been informed of the risks inherent in their work. As recently as 2009, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, testifying before a congressional committee, would not acknowledge any connection between head injuries endured by pro football players and the brain damage that becomes apparent later in their lives. And there is no excuse for that. It's not like science didn't discover this connection until quite recently, and I'm going to pull a Ronald Reagan here and try and make argument by anecdote. Some of you may remember the welfare queen he invented, who was collecting Social Security under 12 different driver's licenses and Social Security cards. When I was 21, finishing my senior year in college, fall of 1969, I got hit in the head playing soccer and had a classic concussion. Got knocked down, stayed down for a very short time, jumped up, kept playing, eventually came off the field, gave my jersey to somebody else, and then a few minutes later was standing on the sideline rubbing my head, and my roommate could see that I was in some distress, some confusion. He came over and he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm okay, but how do we get out here?" And I had lost a whole bunch of time. And eventually went to the infirmary and spoke to a doctor. And by the time I got to the infirmary, I'd begun to get some of my memory back, though there's still a little bit of chunk of time that's gone. And I stayed overnight in the infirmary, and he was a fun doctor. He said, "You may have a fractured skull, but we can't put your head in a cast, so we're going to have to just hope for the best on that." But the next morning, he said, "Now, do you know who the President of the United States is?" And I looked at him and I said, "Shit, it's Bush." At the time it wasn't, but the diagnosis that he gave me was, he said, "You have had a concussion." President, of course, at the time was Nixon. He said, "You've had a concussion. You're going to have some problems for a while." He said, "You're going to have trouble reading. You're going to have trouble concentrating. You may have some sleep issues. You may be confused. If somebody tells a joke, you're going to be the last person in the room to get it." All of that stuff. He said, "You got to expect that. And don't worry about it. You're going to be fine. You're going to get better. Your brain is going to recover." But, he said, "under no circumstances should you put yourself at risk for another head injury for at least a couple of months." For at least a couple of months. This was not a neurosurgeon. This was not a guy who had studied brain injury. This was probably a guy moonlighting. He was probably a resident moonlighting from some hospital in New Haven. And he said, "Don't put yourself at risk for another brain injury for at least a couple of months." Patriots got a guy, his name's Gronkowski, suffered a concussion 2 weeks ago. What a surprise! He was declared ready to play today. I hope he's okay. I really do. I hope he's fine. A more recent example of denial in the service of public relations, more recent than Commissioner Goodell's testimony in 2009, comes from Chris Golick. She's married to a former player and has two sons who played at Notre Dame. 6 years ago, the NFL asked her to help convince mothers that they should encourage their sons to play football. And according to an article George Dorman wrote last year for the Huffington Post, Ms. Golick believes that the task is, quote, her calling in life. Her primary message is that by telling a child he can't play football, a parent is stifling the child, stomping on his dream. While she acknowledges CTE, which she doesn't very much like to do, Ms. Golick, again, according to George Dorman, says, quote, "It isn't happening to everybody. There are plenty of people who are playing football, enjoying a football career, and while they are walking away with bumps and bruises and aches and pains, like my husband has, they are not suicidal and that kind of thing." Ann Osborne, a Syracuse University professor who studied the NFL's campaign to win over women, has said of this approach, quote, "It's like people justifying smoking by saying my grandpa Joe smoked and he lived to be 92. Believe it or not, probably 12, 15 years ago, I had a conversation with a guy who was doing public relations for the National Football League, and I brought up CTE and I brought up brain damage and numbers of players who were in terrible shape and trying to live on a lousy pension and low Social Security, and they needed 24-hour care. And this guy said, "Well, you know, there's a lot of players who don't get brain damage." And I said, "Do you know how closely what you're saying resembles the tobacco industry's defense?" And he said, "Well, that was off the record." That was the best he could do. It was amazing. The NFL's response to the grim news about what's happened to so many former players has been to tinker with the rules and put millions of dollars into the development of a better football helmet, despite the fact that there is no evidence that rule changes or high-tech helmets in any way diminish the tendency of the brain to bounce around in the skull of somebody playing football. Dr. Ann McKee, herself a former football fan, has demonstrated the bouncing around in the brain of the brain in the skull profoundly damages it irreparably. The argument that men who've been stuck in poverty, if they hadn't had the opportunity to earn money by playing football, might seem more compelling. The same argument has been made for boxing, a much less popular sport which has also accounted for brain damage in many of the men who've engaged in it. The question is, when is the culture going to provide a wide enough range of opportunities to disadvantaged men so that sacrificing the health of their brains on the long chance that they'll make a lot of money doing it doesn't seem like a rational choice? I don't know the answer to that question. I hope that we never give up trying to address it. And I'm not as certain as Bob Costas apparently is that football's days are numbered. Lots of coaches from the youth level through the pros continue to maintain that football is the best way in the world to build camaraderie among young men. And lots of kids enjoy the game and they grow into men who love it, and I have no reason to doubt their sincerity. But I worry about their health, and I worry about the health of a nation where people continue to be eager to see men risk their brains and their future health for the entertainment that the risk provides. And in one respect, at least, we're moving in the wrong direction. Whereas President Obama said that if he had sons, he wouldn't have wanted them to play football, the current president has made fun of the NFL for the minimal efforts the league has made to create a safer game. Mr. Trump has indicated that he liked pro football more when players were applauded rather than penalized for brain-rattling helmet-to-helmet hits. It's hard to imagine leaders in Canada calling for more hockey fights, or leaders in England supporting full-contact cricket. But here in the U.S., President Trump's witless macho posturing further enhanced his popularity among lots of football fans and players who preferred the game the way it used to be. The Super Bowl itself is a festival of excess, from the pregame hype to the halftime show, from the anticipation of television's most expensive commercials to the graphics portraying each player as a cross between a god and an indestructible mechanized force. But the Super Bowl is only one game. What makes football dangerous is the accumulation of games that children begin playing almost before their necks are strong enough to hold up their bobbling, helmet-clad heads. What's dangerous, sometimes fatally dangerous, is the accumulation of knocks those heads suffer when they hit other heads or hit knees or hit the ground. In Dr. McKee's laboratory and elsewhere, the evidence is growing that those knocks, the ones serious enough to be labeled concussions, and many, many, many more that players have always been told to shake off, permanently damage the brains of the little boys and the great big men who sustain them. Perhaps the argument that the Super Bowl and the NFL will endure and prevail despite that sad fact has to do with our culture's need, perhaps any culture's need, for blood sport and for larger-than-life figures who sacrifice themselves. In this case, not that others may live, but rather so that others may be entertained. We watch football the way we watched shock and awe. We're okay with football, just as we're okay with the wars this country wages, as long as we win and as long as it's not our children who die in them and as long as they don't go on too long. Maybe those comparisons are unfair, but maybe they're not completely irrelevant, and to the extent that they're not, they may help to explain why the U.S. is the only nation in the world where our brand of football is the country's favorite sport. Thank you.